Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. And whether you're seeing this live or whether you're seeing the recording, I hope that you've been having a great week or weekend, depending. What I'm going to do today is talk about some serious grand theft um, that affected a whole generation of Black people, most likely our parents or grandparents' generation. And it was done through two different events or circumstances that I've never seen put together. I've never seen them examined together. It happened for me when I was researching one thing, and it became apparent to me that this other circumstance was part of this um, by default. And when I say theft, I'm talking about some serious theft that affected literally millions of Black people. And I'm not talking about 40 acres and a mule, I'm talking about more than that. The first part of this is in terms of housing. I want to talk about something called restrictive covenants. Now, I'm showing you an example of a restrictive covenant here. Let me read you part of it. It says, number 8, no such tract, meaning lot or you know, vacant, or a lot or place where there's houses. No such tract shall be used or occupied by persons of any race other than the Caucasian race, except that domestic servants of races other than the Caucasian race may be employed by and domiciled with owners or tenants. Number 9, these covenants shall be covenants running with the land and shall be binding on all the parties hereto, their heirs, uh, devisees, legal representatives, and assigns, and shall continue in force until hell freezes over. No, it doesn't really say hell freezes over. But I want you to understand that covenants were embedded in property deeds all over the country to keep people who were not white from buying or even occupying land. Their popularity has been well documented in St. Louis, Seattle, Chicago, Hartford, Connecticut, Kansas City, Washington, D.C., literally some everywhere. In fact, let's take a look at, now this is in Seattle. Uh, and if you can't see it real clear, if you don't have your monitor on, what is it, on full, whatever, uh, it says basically Carl Brooks calls on Seattle to fight race covenants. Now, when we think about Seattle, Washington, most of the time, most of us don't really think there's too many black people in Seattle, Washington, and there really aren't. Not a whole lot of black people in Washington, period, but there's a reason for that. And you're looking at part of the reason right here. Because if you notice, now this is 1948, and if you notice the photograph there, you see the Ku Klux Klan right there with a burning cross. So they were busy in Washington. So we know that if the Klan was busy, you know good and well they had some quote race covenants. Okay. Now let's take a look at this one. Uh, this one here. Let me make it well full screen. If you should be able to make it full screen, but just in case, I'm going to read you a little bit of it. This is also 1948, and it says greed of real estate interests is the reason for racial covenants. Okay, so understand that this was something that was going on all over the country, that these racial covenants were used to keep black people from being able to get places to live. Now, they did mutate over space and time. Some were different before the war, and then there was some difference after the war. Now here's one in Minneapolis. This deep. It says, the said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. In now this is what it says in the deed. Said this, and this is kind of common. The stipulating that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Now, at the time when that racial restrictive deed was written, which was early on, 1910 at least, Minneapolis was not really that segregated. However, the covenants changed how cities and towns were set up in terms of where black folks could live. It changed the landscape. What they did was they pushed black people into small areas where they could live, smaller and smaller. And even though the numbers of black people kept rising, the places where we could live was always small. And that's why we got, we never got to live in places where we could feel we had breathing room. Okay, they squeezed us into small spaces. And more areas were white and stayed white. And that's where we get to this day the patterns of racial segregation in cities that we see all over the country. Seattle, I have to read you this. In Seattle, one of the deeds said that no part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by the Hebrew, Ethiopian, Malay, or any Asiatic race. Now, this was so strong that by the early 1950s, only 2% of homes built with government backed mortgages since World War II were occupied by black people or other, quote, minorities. 2%. That's going to be important in a minute. Uh, Now, restrictive covenants originally were thought up or pushed by the real estate industry, but then quickly public officials saw them as a way to promote basically neighborhood segregation. In the 1930s, federal housing administrators endorsed these legal instruments and requiring them for projects that use federally backed financing. Now, if you're from certain major cities, urban centers where there's lots of black people, we hear the word projects and we think about federally backed housing. We call them projects. Now, most of the time, we don't really think about how that word got to be used to describe these uh, housing units. We call them projects. Now, the lenders, the banks and mortgage companies, they followed the federal housing authorities. And guess what they started doing? They started doing redlining. Well, they actually adopted the federal government's housing authorities uh, process of redlining in a minute because I got to talk about something else. And that is dealing with the covenants. You see, one of the things I'm showing you is a graphic that keeps flashing by and went across the world because of covenants, restrictive covenants, although most people don't realize that's what it's about. Okay? There's a play, a movie, and even a musical called Raisin in the Sun. And Raisin, which I'll get to the author in a minute, but I need you to understand about Raisin in the Sun. It came about because of Lorraine Hansberry, the author's family's real experience in Chicago. Um, the family moved into a house that was in an area that was all white previously, and the owner had violated the restrictive covenant and sold it to him anyway. The father, Mr. Hansberry, was a real estate person, so he had some kind of way got him to sell him this house. So they moved into it, and they were like, "Whoa!" They were besieged. But I'll come back to the real stuff in a minute. But the play, which uh, became kind of like wasn't just an iconic play in that when it was done, it became the play in New York and Broadway, sort of like the play that a black actor had to do. Um, I mean, seriously, when it came out, it premiered on Broadway at the Ethel Barrymore Theater on March 11th, 1959. And the original cast included Sidney Poitier, Ruby Dee, Ivan Dixon. That was the brother on uh, what's the name of the show about the soldiers in the Soldiers of War. It was a comedy. He also was the director of The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Who else was in that? Claudia McNeil, Diana Sands, Glenn Turman. Yeah. And then Ossie Davis took over later uh, as Walter Lee. Then they did the film version in 1961, and that one had Sidney Poitier, Ruby Dee, Claudia McNeil, Dinah Sands, Lou Gossett Jr. Then they did a revival in 2004, and that was the one with Sean Combs, also known as Diddy, and also Phylicia Rashad played the mama. Also in that version, a young man by the name of Bill Nunn played the character named Bobo. We may not recognize the name, but if I say Radio Raheem, you would know that name. That's Bill Nunn, the late Bill Nunn. He was in the 2004 revival. Okay. And so it became like the play to do. Even Denzel was in a version. But the interesting thing to me is that there's some people, actors, who are very upset these days because they say all of these non-American blacks are getting roles in the movies, uh, and that are in movies getting roles of American blacks, and they think that is something new. It's not new. If you go back and look at the earlier movies and plays, Sidney Poitier was not a quote American black, right? And we didn't have a problem with him. In fact, if you think about it, Sidney Poitier came to this country. He learned how to speak American English, uh, listening to the radio and watching TV. Also, there were other actors, Harry Belafonte. Okay, so it wasn't unusual that quote non-American blacks. And I hate that term because we all black. The only difference was we got dropped off at different points on the boat ride. Okay, but it is P. Diddy and Phylicia Rashad, Sanaa Lathan. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the real story and the real person, and that's the young lady who actually graduated from my high school, my alma mater, Lorraine Hansberry, and she grew up on the south side of Chicago. Her parents were activists. They don't talk about this, but there's a reason why that story and that play came into being. They were activists. They moved into an area and they challenged the restrictive covenants. What's not generally known is that they sued, well, actually, they got sued by the white folks, tried to force them out, suing them. They lost the family, the Hansberry family lost the case on the local level, and then some very prominent attorneys who also were attorneys for the Policy Kings, and some of the Policy Kings contributed money to that fight, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Hansberries, but it took years. And let me read you something that Lorraine Hansberry wrote about in her book, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. She said, 25 years ago, my father spent a small personal fortune, his considerable talents, and many years of his life fighting in association with NAACP attorneys, Chicago's restrictive covenants in one of this nation's ugliest ghettos. That fight also required our family to occupy disputed property in a hellishly hostile white neighborhood in which literally howling mobs surrounded our house. My memories of this correct way of fighting white supremacy in America include being spat at, cursed, and pummeled in the daily trek to and from school. And I also remember my desperate and courageous mother patrolling our household all night with a loaded German Luger pistol, doggedly guarding her 4 children, while my father fought the respectable part of the battle in the Washington court. Now, see, that's deep because you don't get that in the play. In fact, you don't generally hear about that at all. That they literally had to deal with mobs of people who basically every day and night they were harassing this black family, trying to force them to move. Okay? But if you look it up, 1940, Hansberry versus Lee, uh, and they fought it, and eventually they this case became part of what eventually knocked down uh, restrictive covenants in this country. And yet you don't really know that because you don't really hear about what really occurred. All right, so I have to thank. Now, this graphic, I put this graphic here because I ran across this, and it'll come back again. But in this photograph, there was Lorraine Hansberry, there was Nina Simone, the actor named Theodore Bickel or Bickel. He had a fundraiser at his house, not for the Hansberry. This was for the civil rights movement because she was very much involved in the civil rights movement. Also, in this photograph, all the way over to the right, the gentleman in the suit, his name is James Foreman. Now, James Foreman also went to Inglewood High School. And so, in that photograph, Lorraine Hansberry and James Foreman, who went to school apparently at the same time at Inglewood, James Foreman went on to become one of the architects of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he's not very well known, but he was a hell of a guy. And the fact that he went to my high school makes it even cooler. And the fact that Nina Simone is in that picture. So it's like, see, there were people, black people work together, even though you don't see this recorded in the history books. Uh, and that's because that's on purpose. Okay. So now that's dealing with restrictive covenants. So that, as I mentioned, that was one of the major deals which kept black people from being able to get housing, right? So then, when they began to break through in terms of restrictive covenants not being legal, so they started knocking those down around the country. Then we had the government doing something that the banks loved, and it's called redlining. Now, we've heard some things about redlining in the last few years, but first what happened was that they blamed it on the banks, and it only came out later, last couple of years, that the U.S. government is who started this. As you look at these maps that keep popping up, you'll see that some parts are basically red. Let me explain what redlining truly is. Redlining is the practice of arbitrarily denying or limiting financial services to specific neighborhoods, generally because the residents are people of color or are poor. While discriminatory practices existed in the banking and insurance industries well before the 1930s, the New Deal Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, instituted a redlining policy by developing color coded maps of American cities that use racial criteria to categorize lending and insurance risks. New, affluent, racially homogeneous housing areas received green lines, while black and poor white neighborhoods were also often circumscribed by red lines denoting their undesirability. Banks and insurers soon adopted the these government housing maps to guide lending and underwriting decisions. Further, the Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934, also used the same methods to assess locations for federally insured new housing construction. Now, without bank loans and insurance, uh, red line areas lack the capital essential for investment and redevelopment. As a result, after World War II, suburban areas received preference for residential investment at the expense of, quote, minority and poor neighborhoods in cities, many cities, including my hometown. And this lack of investment in new housing, rehabilitation, and home improvement contributed significantly to the decline of older urban neighborhoods, and it compounded cities' decline in relation to the suburbs. Now, why is that important to understand? Because for years it's been blamed on black people that we destroyed our neighborhoods, that we didn't take care of our communities, that we got on, they were pristine, and that we just wore them down and tore them down. That's not true. It's one of the worst of the lies that were told about us. Okay? Now, let me show you how deep this got. Uh, as you see these cities on these maps with these large areas, wherever you see the red, those were black or basically poor whites, but mostly black areas where there was the banks did not loan money for mortgages, and they didn't. The banks and the mortgage companies didn't do it, and the cities themselves did not invest in those neighborhoods. Now, the impact of redlining, this is built, all right? So then when the plants closed and eventually they tore them down, these expressways still existed and they went from Detroit out to nowhere. One of these areas, though, uh, it's called 8 Mile Road because it was 8 miles long. And at one point, the city in the 1940s, they built a wall to separate the black community from the white community. And it was called, the divider was the 8 Mile Road. And there's two things about it that I remember historically. One was the mayor, when they got a black mayor one time, the first time I guess, he was famous for telling the criminals at one point, "You got to leave Detroit. You better hit 8 Mile Road." He was telling the quote black criminals to go out to the white suburbs, and then white folks said, "Oh hell no." The other is that Eminem, who's from Detroit, if I'm not mistaken, one of his albums was called 8 Mile. That's where they came from, the 8 Mile Road. But they did all kinds of things uh, with the redlining. In fact, let me see, where is this? I got to go back a minute because one of the things they did, let me see if I can find this right quick. And we don't think about this. We don't have no understanding that this happens because of this. One is called traffic jams. In most big cities, you have what's called rush hour in the morning and the evening, and we just think that that's just coincidental. It's not. Let me see if I can find this. Uh, show you a map or show you an overhead of one city where the expressway was intentionally driven through a black community, well, a separation of the black community. Um, and that was so that the white folks could come from the suburbs and go down. There it is right there. You see that? You see that expressway going through there? Sometimes they call them freeways, right? Because they're supposed to be free. But it was set up in such a way, number one, to split up a community and to allow white people in the suburbs to be able to easily come in to work in downtown, in the downtown area, and then to go home. I know it's like that in Chicago, and you go to Detroit and Baltimore, Atlanta, all these different cities, and they have these rush hours and traffic jams that people think are accidental. No, they were part of what happened when you racially segregate and tear up areas. Where I live in Chicago is called Inglewood. Inglewood went from being mostly white for its whole existence until within a 10-year period it went from being majority white to majority black. And most of us don't know why that happened. It happened because they built the Dan Ryan Expressway in the late 50s, early 60s. And what they did was they ran this expressway from downtown straight out south of the city, and they ran it right through a black community. And you have to understand, when they do expressways, that upheaves a lot of people. So that whole route where the folks were upended for this Dan Ryan Expressway, those people moved east and west of where the expressway is. Inglewood is west of where the expressway is. And so all those black folks that got displaced, they went east and west of the expressway. And in Inglewood, that caused it to go from majority white to majority black in like a 10-year period. Um, and they haven't recovered yet. They want it back. That's why they gentrified it. It's going through gentrification now. Um, so understand about redlining, because what that did was you got a whole generation, at least a whole generation of black people that no matter how hard they worked and no matter how they paid their bills and everything else, they still could not get mortgages because of a policy that froze them out. So no matter how they tried, they couldn't get mortgages. Not a few of them got through, but the vast majority didn't, and it was because of a policy. When you see those red places, that was the government saying, no, you ain't got to loan money and don't have to do no mortgages in those areas. And so millions of black families and members of those black families, they were restricted first by the covenants and then by the redlining from decent places to live. And you know why that's so important is that we have in this country, and if you notice all around the world, wherever you see black people being squeezed by white people, They force us to live in crowded conditions. There's no way for people to grow up. And if you notice how they do for themselves, whether it was going back to the plantations, they had big old houses, lots of land, lots of room. They could breathe. That's why we know what it feels like to say, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. We know what it felt like to garner. We were used to being choked. So now that was one part of it, the whole housing thing. And see, you have to understand housing is part of how they say you get wealth in this country. That's how you build wealth. So if we were restricted from getting housing, it didn't matter whether we worked hard or not because we wasn't getting the mortgages. The second area is something that this literally in a lot of ways broke the backs of a lot of black families. And when I say that, I mean it like this. I've heard this expression from time to time that the black woman is the backbone of the black family. That's not true. The backbone of any community, of any group of people, is the men. But they chose to do that to black men to say, well, y'all ain't the backbone. And they push that, and you even have some black women who will echo that. Now, it's true, black women have had to carry more than their fair share of the responsibilities for the families. But there's a reason for that, and it's not that black men are derelict in their duty. I'm getting ready to share something with you that when you look at it, and plus when you add to it what I just shared with you about the covenants and the redlining, this is a backbreaker. It's called the GI Bill of Rights, formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Now, a lot of us have heard of the GI Bill, although we didn't realize it was called the GI Bill of Rights. Okay? And it was created to help the veterans of World War II readjust, come back from the war. Now, here's what was cold-blooded. The bill established hospitals, like we talk about the Veterans Hospital, right? They didn't just pop up by accident, they were created. They made low-interest loans, low-interest mortgages available, and they granted stipends covering tuition and expenses for veterans attending colleges or trade school. Now, from 1944 to 1949, nearly 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion of the bill's unemployment compensation program. And let me back up a second here. 44 to 49. What's that, 5 years? Yeah. Nearly 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion. Now, this is in the 40s. $1 billion, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at that. If you never heard me talk about it, let me break it down, because we have become burned by a misunderstanding of about millions and billions. First of all, $1 million is 1,000 thousands. Or put another way, $1 million is 10,000 $100 bills. 10,000 $100 bills. Now, $1 billion is 1,000 millions. Let me say that again, 1,000 millions. So, in other words, if somebody has $1 billion, they could give $100 million to somebody, and they would still have $900 million left. That's more money than you can imagine. Okay? So, in that 5 year period, they paid out close to $4 billion for the unemployment compensation program. Now, the education and training provisions existed till 1956, while the Veterans Administration offered insured loans until 1962. The Readjustment Benefits Act of 1966 extended these benefits to all veterans of the armed forces, including those who had served during peacetime. The GI Bill of Rights almost single-handedly built the American middle class by addressing core social needs. Listen carefully: unemployment, education, and health care. This was for veterans. And importantly, it did this through government backed, low interest, fixed rate mortgages with zero or low down payments and up to 30-year terms. In effect, the GI Bill put homes within reach of all but the poorest American vets. Now, understand the GI Bill guaranteed low interest mortgages and other loans, but they were not administered by the VA itself. The VA could co sign, but not actually guarantee the loans. That gave white run financial institutions free reins to refuse mortgages and loans to black people. In 1947, only two of more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to black veterans. Let me say that again. They had more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities. Only two supported home purchases by non whites. Let me say that one again: 67,000 mortgages, right? And intentionally froze black people out. One of the ways they did it, which was real sneaky, and it caused us so much shame that we didn't even realize what was happening. And that was to what? It was through the dishonorable discharge. So many black men got dishonorable discharges for little or nothing. And in some cases, we were glad just to get out. We were still alive, not understanding that if you got a dishonorable discharge, you were not eligible for the GI Bill of Rights. Y'all hear me? And not only was it the dishonorable discharge, but I'm trying to think of what the other one. See, there was honorable discharge, there was dishonorable discharge, and then there was another category. It wasn't quite dishonorable, but it wasn't honorable. And it also kept you from getting the GI Bill. So the GI Bill was used to basically set up white boys to be able to take advantage of either school, jobs, business, farms. The housing was deep because um, let me tell you like this. In 1946, get this, a newly constructed 6-room house in the suburbs cost around $5,150. You heard me. A 6-room house cost about $5,000, a little bit over $5,000. If you got a government backed mortgage, The typical down payment was roughly $550 with a monthly mortgage of $29 and change. Do y'all hear me? The house cost 5 grand. You could get in it with $550 down payment and a monthly mortgage of $29 and change. Paid over a period of 25 years. If you had lived in New York City, a similar sized apartment ran $50 a month. Okay? By 1950, suburban growth was 10 times that of urban cities, and for the first time, more than half of Americans own their own homes, 55% to be exact, and they got those homes through a whole bunch of them got their homes through the GI Bill and through FHA. They did the same thing. So by 1952, 2.4 million veterans had received government backed loans. But now, virtually an entire generation of black people missed out on their 750 square foot piece of the American dream. The post war housing boom almost entirely excluded black folks, most of whom remained in cities that received less and less investment from businesses and banks. Black veterans in search of education that they had been promised, right? Many black men returning home from the war didn't even try to take advantage of the educational benefits because they couldn't afford it. They needed to start working. But those who did found they were at a considerable disadvantage. Public education gave them poor preparation, right? Uh, the veterans applications flooded universities. Black veterans often found themselves totally left out. They, the northern universities were, very slow about admitting black veterans, and in the South, they just didn't deal with black veterans at all. Uh, Now, a lot of times, if a black veteran, could get through to somebody at the VA, they would encourage them to take vocational training. Okay. Um, 95% of the black veterans who attempted to get the GI Bill to cover their education were pushed off on black colleges. A lot of them were underfunded and overwhelmed by the number of new students. And a lot of them were unaccredited at the time. So they had to turn away thousands of veterans. Woo! The original GI Bill ended in July of 1956. By that time, nearly 8 million World War II veterans had received education or training, and 4.3 million home loans worth $33 billion had been handed out. Most black veterans didn't get none of that. Okay? So at the time, through that process, college degrees, white boys was getting college degrees by the ton. They were getting the home mortgages, and they blew up in the suburbs. You had places like Levittown, which uh, 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 they built for what I described earlier, 750 square feet. Okay, they put these cookie cutter homes, and these suburbs just literally damn near appeared overnight, and they were full of white people. Mm. That's why today you have a huge gap. They call it a wealth gap. Because what were we told? We were told you had to get a house. A house was a key to wealth. The median wealth for white households in the United States today is about 171,000. For black households, it's about 17,000. So white households' median wealth is 10 times that of black people. And remember what I said. By 1956, almost 10 million veterans had received GI Bill benefits. That's what I meant about this theft. You had a huge, huge, huge helping hand given to white veterans and black men, by and large, black men, because in World War II, majority of servicemen and black folks, you had some black women, but for the largest number was black men. And so they came back from the war, and not only did they have to deal with the discrimination in other ways, but even with the GI Bill, which they were guaranteed for fighting for this country, they were shut out from it. So they couldn't get housing, they couldn't get education. And here's the part that's not talked about. Can you imagine how frustrating that had to have been? How debilitating that had to have been? How humiliating that had to have been? And so, as I mentioned, it broke the backs of many black households. We don't even know how many households broke up because of this. Because there's this there's this belief among, even to this day, that if a black man is trying to do stuff and he runs up into the bureaucracy, you have too many black women that say, "Oh, that's something wrong with you. It's not the system." But the system has shown us over and over again. The system has done us in with the redlining. That was the U.S. government that started that. They're the ones that put those maps out there that redline black communities. Okay? The GI Bill was the government's way of helping white boys coming back from the war to get a heck of an advantage over black men because they denied us. So it wasn't that there was anything wrong with black people. Wasn't nothing wrong with black men. And can you imagine all the black men who came back after serving so valiantly in the war and then to be denied the same thing that their white counterparts could get and go to school and get loans and move their families out to nice little houses? And we were stuck in these ghettos, which progressively got worse because the banks and the mortgage companies and even the cities didn't invest in those communities. And the industries moved out of those areas and go out to the suburbs where the white people were. And we have not known this. And so there are many, many younger black people who think that their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation failed them because they didn't do stuff. They didn't, because we were not taught the true history of things. We think that they failed. They don't understand that it wasn't failure, it was done purposely to hold us back. I'm going to close with something that I ran across from Lorraine Hansberry. And it's deep because it's nice. It's nice. She said, "I think then that Negroes must concern themselves with every single means of struggle, legal, illegal, passive, active, violent, and nonviolent, that they must harass, debate, petition, give money to court struggles, sit in, lie down, strike, boycott, sing hymns, pray on steps, and shoot from their windows when the racists come cruising through their communities. The acceptance of our present condition is the only form of extremism which discredits us before our children. As from To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, page 214. Lorraine Hansberry. I bet you never saw that, and it's not in Raising in the Sun. With that, I leave you with my thought of no justice, no peace, no love, KNOW.